let me pass on to you in regards and let you know that she may be able to come and meet you all later today or tomorrow. But even if she's not here, I want to take the chance to thank her for her fundamental support for this initiative from the very beginning. Let me also express our gratitude, mine personally, but also on behalf of AIRS, to Europe Direct, Punto, Europa, and especially to Fabio Cassini and Valerio Comono, who contributed a great deal to this event. I also want to thank the Facoltà di Scienze Politiche Roberto Filli and the project Inclusion and Outstanding, financed by the European Commission and Germany Action. Without their support, all of this would have not been possible. Thank you also to our discussants and panelists who have joined us today. And I'm delighted to be joined in opening this conference by Cristina Lopez. She's a researcher in European Integration Studies and project manager at the Centre d'Histoire de la Connaissance de l'Europe. Cristina obtained her PhD and Master's in History and Civilization at the European University Institute of Florence, and she's a member of the AIRS Steering Committee. Before handing over to her, let me just quickly update you on some changes that we have made to the program. Maud Carbonell could not make it to Philly, and so the formal presentation in our second panel will be shorter, but that gives us additional time to debate all the papers that will be presented, and I hope we will take full advantage of this opportunity. So now, Cristina,
thank you very much for the presentation, Alessandra, and especially for the opportunity of being here to share with you different ideas and opinions, comments about this very important perspective that I think is normally neglected. The views from outside, the impressions, the perceptions, and the evolutions of the consideration of the process of European integration in the eyes of the others. So thank you so much for this very interesting proposal that you submitted to HERS. Very briefly, I would like to talk to you about the history of European Integration Research Society, HERS, which is very closely linked to the RISHI network that I'm sure that many of you know as well. We have created this network in 2004 at the University of Cambridge, specifically at the Center for International Studies, in an inaugurational conference about the history of European integration and the different sources, archives, and perspectives that were being analyzed by the younger generations of historians and other humanities and social science researchers. So the main idea of the founders of this network was to channel an enthusiasm that was there to conduct research on European integration studies from an interdisciplinary perspective, especially taking into account a historical approach and the value of historical analysis and contribution for this field. We had the impression that we shared an interest in this critical approach to European integration studies, but we didn't know who was working on different topics all over Europe and also internationally, and we decided to create a channel for this enthusiasm in critical analysis on European studies. So first of all, we started this initial project by launching annual conferences from 2004 onwards. Each year they take place in a different country, normally the European Union, but we also envisage to enlarge this in the future, so if you have any proposal, we'll be very happy to hear about that. And after the conferences, we normally provide a platform for publication, because the idea was to offer a visibility for this younger generation of researchers to show their research results, but also to launch new ideas for the debate and to have an impact at the level of publication and the general discussions on the topic. It was also a meeting point between very famous and recognized experts in this discipline and this younger generation of researchers. And also afterwards we created a website in which the different members will register. It's still in progress, so we'll develop it in the future. But the idea is to continue with this publication platform. We also want to once an essay prize we envisage to repeat, and people who really can exchange freely information on archives and sources and secondary literature and help to build the different projects. The main outcome of this network is to provide, I would say, almost familiar atmosphere for discussion. I'm sure you will see it here in this conference, and especially thanks to Alessandra, who has done a lot to provide already this kind of atmosphere. It's not based on judgments or just plain critiques, but very much on trying to help and trying to offer new perspectives on your current projects. Because even if many people, many of the participants are not experts in your specific subfield, I'm sure you would be able to provide a fresh opinion and many times a very useful feedback for your own projects. So you will see this almost a familiar discussion. It's an atmosphere based on cordiality and openness, and I don't know, if you have any suggestion, we'll be very glad to incorporate it. Also, it's very curious that most of the people who have been part and are part of this network, and I see here many familiar faces from other conferences as well. We are still working in this field of European integration study, history of European integration. I think it's something that fascinates us. And as a conclusion, I would like to say that the main objective for the creation of the history of European integration to research society is to observe that despite the differences between topics, approaches, methodologies applied, we all share common points. So through these conferences, we can discover these synergies and make the most of them. The papers this year, I must say, have an incredibly high quality, and I'm sure these synergies will reveal very fruitful for our panel discussion. If in the future you would like to organize a first conference, that was my suggestion also for Alessandra when we met. We are open to all kinds of proposals. So let's discover the excellence of this discussion we're going to have and the fruitfulness of these synergies we are about to discover. And before getting into your papers, I'm very pleased and very honored to introduce you to Professor from the European University in Florence, who will speak about the legacy of the Europe.
Thank you. Thanks. I would sort of limit myself to one aspect of the influence of Milward's work, that is the sort of international history of post-war Europe, and therefore it's a set of considerations that are centered. I mean, on most of his books about post-war Europe, but perhaps more densely about reconstruction rather than the European rescue of the nation state, and you probably understand why. Focusing on three main issues that were at the center of historiographical debate in the 1980s. That is, the place of Western Europe in the emerging transatlantic world of the post-war Europe. The framing of the initial stage of integration in a broader context. And what I think is perhaps in the long run Anna's major contribution, Western Europe's rescuing its own agency. I should tell you beforehand that I had worked with Anna for a very long time at the EUI and then at LSE from 1984 to 1991. So we had countless discussions that no doubt affect my considerations. And the mix of memories and rereading of his works is something obviously highly personal. The two things can hardly be disentangled, which means that you are quite entitled to challenge my personal reconstructions of Milward's contribution and contrast it with much less personal reading of his work. First, I would like to dwell on where we stood as historians in the early to mid-1980s. That is, on the peculiar historiographical context that Milward, as well as everybody else, of course, was contending with at the time when he was writing Reconstruction. For well over a decade, throughout the soon to be canonized as an innovative synthesis, as John Gaddis named it, of the origin of the Cold War. Now, post-revisionists accepted a broad, if vague, notion of empire. The American one was, many of them would argue, of a defensive nature. Here is Gaddis again using the term. An empire endowed with enormous resources, but also a sort of inbuilt sense of restraint, in their opinion. More importantly, it was assumed to be a highly successful one, and a highly efficient one as well. Post-revisionists generally avoided an exceptionalist rhetoric about America, but they also avoided comparisons with other experiences of empire or hegemony. The prevailing assumption was that the international projection of US power had such peculiar, nation-specific features as to be virtually unique. Their intellectual thrust and research agenda concentrated on the internal determinants of US policies. Domestic politics, interest representation, strategic culture, institutional infighting. Very little energy, if any, was channeled into studying the impact of US policies on foreign societies, which remained a stated but quite elusive aspiration. All these features were quite visible if you go through them and read them now in a sort of package in the emerging studies on US economic policies towards post-war Europe, and primarily the European recovery program. The Marshall Plan was perceived as the most effective and enlightened pillar of containment, the key to America's successful waging of the Cold War in Europe. These new studies had little to do with the apologetic narrative that had been written a few years before, mostly by protagonists themselves of the Marshall Plan days, but by focusing primarily on origins and intent, that is to say, on visions, plans, ideas, rather than results and accomplishment of the Marshall Plan. These studies neither confirmed nor dispelled the inherent assumption that the plan had been an unrestrained success, which continued to hang around untested and therefore uncontested. Attempts at measuring not only US power, but also the limits of its influence were very rare. American literature at the time was largely oblivious to the role, motives, influence of European reconstructions, other actors. There were exceptions, of course, the most influential being the work on the political economy of post-war European stabilizations by Charles Mayer, Harvard historian Charles Mayer, who saw in the New Deal mix of Fordist production and consumption, social coalitions for growth, and a culture of prosperity. In this, he saw the template for what he called the politics of productivity, which reshaped Western European societies by sidelining radical antagonism. Here, the recipe emerging from the American experience and its deliberate projection abroad with the mechanism of the European Recovery Program was central. But the concept of the politics of productivity shifted the focus of inquiry to the local actors, to the type of solutions, compromises that governments, political parties, interest representation groups would engineer in France, Italy, Germany, Britain, wherever. Therefore, it opened a bridge, which many scholars would later explore in detail, between the American project and its segmented, mediated, often limited and compromised impact within different national contexts. Now, Milward had an open dialogue with Charlie Mayer, as they shared the common ground, that is to say, the crucial role attributed to the local coalitions of political, economic, social actors as the decisive agents of reconstruction, and therefore as the focal point of historical inquiry. But Milward seemed to conceive of American cultural influence as a factor operating primarily in the public arena, in the realm of intellectual debate and ideological constructions rather than in political and economic decision making. The politics of productivity, he wrote, were every bit as useful to European politicians hoping to back a central political position, but the forces within those countries were usually much stronger and had much more effective weapons at hand than the economic cooperation administration. And here, I think we come to the true bone of contention at the time, and in many ways even retrospectively. That is agency. Who drove Reconstruction? Who devised its political and institutional recipes, engineered its compromises? Which actors and factors weighed more decisively in shaping the complex interdependence that defined the post-war Atlantic world? Milward's work never touched upon the strategic and ideological framework of the Cold War. Not because it deemed it irrelevant or secondary, but because it took it for granted as the overall determinant of the geopolitical map. He simply assumed that the US pursued the strategic goal, I quote again, to develop a bloc of states which would share similar political, social, economic, and cultural values. But contentment was not his goal. Milward sort of was mindful of its importance and of America's decisive power in the realm of security strategies, but basically he just left all these dimension to the investigation of other scholars. So what was Milward actually saying when he argued in one of his most controversial points that, I quote again, the Marshall Plan did not save Europe from economic collapse, and that the Marshall Aid was not in fact important enough to give the United States sufficient leverage for reconstruction of Western Europe according to its own wishes, which were statements that American scholarship at the time took as highly provocative. I think it was not so much devaluing American power or undermining its crucial role in the post-war era as qualifying and contextualizing it. It was in a way historicizing it, I think. Milward was first and foremost reacting. I mean, here I'm sort of trying myself to historicize Milward, which I think is probably the most appropriate approach in this context. I think it was first and foremost reacting to a dominant historiographical paradigm that investigated US ideals, strategic power, or economic ambition, but saw everybody else either as recipients of America's benevolence or helpless objects of its imperial projection. Even post-revisionist scholars rarely rose above this introverted, inherently exceptionalist intellectual framework. So the American empire, whether benevolent, oppressive, or defensive, remained a one-way affair, whose strength and effectiveness flowed upward, seemingly independent from the allies it reached, the feedback it got, the interactions that ensued. Milward's reconstruction moved deliberately, quite deliberately, against this sort of deus ex machina approach to post-war European history. And he overturned it, as we know. Instead of a single overpowering force, armed with a dazzling model of production and consumption, his scene was dominated by varying among multiple actors, mediations and compromises, solutions achieved by detours and give and take. Agency was not monopolized, but diffused and fragmented, with key political resources distributed unequally but widely. The end result was a complex system of multilateral, internally differentiated interdependence that bore little resemblance to Washington's original plans, but would still suit America's main strategic aims precisely because it accommodated the other actors' needs and goals. And I quote from the conclusion of Reconstruction: "In place of a liberal unified Europe," Allen wrote, "came a closely regulated little European Commonwealth. Western Europe made its own peace settle. It created an alternative pattern of reconstruction, a restricted but workable institutional framework for economic interdependence, which has proved more effective than any previous peace settlement. There is very little to say that this was not, in the end, the best solution for the United States too." End of quote. So in his sort of iconoclastic and occasionally abrasive polemical drive, Milward was shifting the focus of inquiry onto the political economy of Western European nations. In doing so, he was also positing a more nuanced and I would say a realistic notion of hegemony in the Atlantic world, which underlies his text, although he never fully articulated it. U.S. ability to reorder the international economic system, coalesce the Western alliance, and erect a functioning architecture of containment did not flow automatically from its military and economic might, nor from its post-war visions and plans, important as they were. It had to be constructed with flexibility, policy shifts, adaptations, in a constant dialogue with other governments. The key to success then was interaction, convergence, adjustment. Since, I quote again from Reconstruction, the leverage which Marshall Aid gave to the United States in matters of grand policy was small, unless it were coupled to genuinely powerful political forces in Europe. It was at the time a conceptual breakthrough, criticized by several American diplomatic historians as a new European revisionist or an implicit trivialization of the American connection with Europe, this is Kaplan speaking, or uncomfortably recognized but with very many reservations, for instance by Michael Owen. The controversial impact it had on historical studies of post-war Europe is, I think, quite evident. However, articulated in a variety of approaches and interpretations, historiography of post-war Europe and of the Atlantic world has since advanced within the intellectual framework of a negotiated interdependence, while notions of a top-down Atlantic order have become increasingly marginal and ultimately irrelevant. A present-day perspective on the long-term evolution and effectiveness of U.S. international hegemony brings to the fore also another epistemological benefit inherent in Milward's scholarly contribution. We now reconsider Cold War history through a comparative assessment of the sources of strength and weakness of each superpower, among many other things, of course. One of the key factors that have acquired explanatory relevance concerns their respective ability to forge alliances and manage coalitions. Even historians with otherwise very divergent interpretations of Cold War history, think of John Gallis on one hand and Arne Wester on the other, converge in emphasizing the comparative and progressively larger advantage that the West enjoyed in this respect and its long-term importance. The Soviets dilapidated their post-war ideological and political influence, suffered more setbacks than successes in managing their allies in Europe, in the Arab world, elsewhere in the Global South, and were strategically weakened by a string of ruptures in the international communist movement from Yugoslavia to Euro-communism that grew to become strategically disastrous in the case of China. In contrast with this crippling inability to mediate, include and adapt, we have come to see the Western coalition as more expansive, attractive, resilient, and effective, which depended, of course, in large measure on its much larger financial and economic resources, but also it derived from its internal mechanism of negotiation and compromise, and the much wider margins of flexibility and change that they allowed. So at the end of the day, U.S. hegemony proved to be proportional to its ability to build alliances that accommodated differences, rather than suffocate. Where this was not the case, and direct domination prevailed, as in several third world countries, U.S. influence was more limited, temporary, and imbalance. The more adaptable and inclusive character of America's international outreach was already visible and important in the post-war period, and became increasingly so in the 60s and 70s. It was one of the key resources of Western superiority throughout the bipolar era. Now, Milward did not participate in this more recent evolution of scholarly interpretations about the Cold War, of course, nor did he partake in the post-colonial rethinking of the empire, But the characterization of the Western coalition as plural, negotiated, and adaptable stems in no small part from the well-known dynamics of the founding period in its Euro-American core. It is quite plausible and indeed probable that we as historians might eventually have gotten where we are by different routes, but there is no denying that Milward's work pointed this way, and that we got where we are also by way of his depiction of the construction of a system of international economic interdependence, which built on the few interests which the national economies did have in common. Milward's work also amounted to a refutation of traditional approaches to international history centered only on strategic thinking and high policy relations between chancelleries and diplomats. And complexity here operated horizontally as well as vertically, I think, in his work. Because the real challenge for historical analysis of the post-war world at the time was the attempt to explain its prosperity and stability, which from the perspective of the 1970s or early 80s was still quite a puzzle, especially vis-à-vis the disastrous instability of the previous decades of European history. And this required the opening up of subfields and their interlinking in an effort to correlate economic and social change to political and international transformations and vice versa. Diplomatic history, Allen wrote in perhaps his most direct engagement with US historiography, is superficial stuff unless it relates to what is actually happening inside countries. Now, assessing the impact that Milward's reconfiguration of the US role in Europe has had on subsequent historiography is not a linear task. Individual interpretations obviously differ, obviously clash. More importantly, it seems to me, his argument, as well as other historians that operated at the time, sort of percolated into a variety of subfields, each one with its peculiar emphasis and angle, and where therefore contested or appropriated and rearranged in partial selective ways. We can try to group these very broadly. Scholars who focused on security and strategy have generally very little use for Milward's arguments. The indispensable role of America's power of deterrence, the centrality of Germany, and the German question for peace in Europe drive them to argue that defense and geopolitics were far more relevant than economic arrangements, and therefore that US influence was deeper and more compelling than any reasoning on the Marshall Plan would suggest. Gerhard extends this thesis to embrace European integration as well, and argues that the pivotal importance of the integration of Germany in Western Europe gave the US far more leverage than Milward concedes. Issues of peace and security certainly affected the dynamics of European construction and integration in crucial ways. Milward did not integrate them in his analytical and interpretive framework, and I think this is probably the major vulnerability of his work. But one cannot fail to notice that even if you look at the most, what I think is the most thorough account of the European diplomatic and security settlement by American historian of strategy Mark Trachtenberg, can do entirely without Milward. Milward is not even the bibliography of that very big book, but his reading, his reconstruction of the European settlement revolves on what? Revolves on a complex framework of intra-Western negotiation, much more than unilateral American commanding authority. The template, in short, is quite similar to what Milward deployed on economic policy matters. For economists and economic historians, on the other hand, evaluations of the Marshall Plan and of the many issues correlated to it changed irreversibly since Milward's work. Claims that the Marshall Plan dollars saved the world, as Charles Kindleberger wrote in the late 90s, sound like quaint relics of the distant past nowadays. The main accounts of Europe's reconstruction and growth, published since the early 90s, things of Kraft Antoniolo, Barry Eichengreen's, they all emphasize centrality of corporatist arrangements and patterns, and institutional paths as well. The nature of European integration is defined, at least in its initial stage, by national interest and national projects for growth, much more than American prodding, for sure, even though American aid is recognized as a contributing factor. If you look at the most recent attempt to sum up the state of the art by William Hitchcock in the Cambridge History of the Cold War, he concludes that, quote, Marshall aid did not restart European economic growth, but it allowed European states to continue along the path of industrial expansion and investment in order to promote a politically essential welfare state. The plan's true contribution then was in restoring economic choices to Europeans, away from the deflationary strictures of the 1930s, and in doing so, it also restored political choices. So the focus has shifted quite considerably. American aid had, Charlie Meyer wrote, a qualitative more than a quantitative impact, something that in the early 80s was still considered unthinkable. Without policies that sustained growth and improved standards of living, and by doing this supported robust centrist political coalitions in most Western European nations, without those policies, the decisive change, I'm quoting from Meyer again, the decisive change of post-war politics, the capacity to leave behind the politics of the interwar period with its totalitarian appeals to the left and right would perhaps not have occurred. Tony Judd, another scholar of post-war Europe, writes that Milward's reasoning seems hard to refute. The importance of the Marshall Plan, he says, was psychological, even more than economic or political. It is certainly no coincidence, I think, that nowadays the Marshall Plan retains an iconic centrality only in the studies on the culture of consumption. Iconic but no longer fundamental, the Marshall Plan has therefore become one factor among the many that combine to assemble what we would probably call a transnational economic growth, based on complex coordination between various actors, American and European, governmental and societal, private and public, or if you want to use Carlos Pagnola's definition, a collaborative political economy that embodied a compromise between liberal capitalism and social democracy. Now, mapping the legacy of Milward's work would require a critical analysis much broader than this succinct and personal sketch of the literature, which is merely conducive to my concluding point. The attempt to highlight another impulse behind Milward's effort to refashion America's role and put the European nation-states at the center of reconstruction. If you read his works now, you might be struck by the pervasive presence of a set of questions that lurk in the background of reconstruction, are more explicitly addressed, but still not completely worked out in the European history of the nation-state, but that to the present-day reader appear sort of to burst through those texts with sort of fresh strength. And these are questions that came fully alive a few years later, in 1995, in a short essay that inaugurated the journal European Integration History. There, Alan was outlining the state-of-the-art in integration history and suggesting a new agenda. He centered his appeal for a new scholarly efforts to unravel the mechanism of integration and understand the transformation of European societies in the second half of the 20th century, focusing on the notion of allegiance. Which is bizarre, mind you, if you consider Milward's previous path. Because here you have the economic historian who had worked primarily on trade flows, government policies and intergovernmental arrangements, growth statistics, who is now recommending required, it stressed, a wholly different analysis from that used for earlier periods. So, trying to read back what allegiance means through his previous work, you find out, or I found out in rereading them, that in reconstruction, Milward had related European governments' international policy choices to their new post-war domestic goals and necessities, but these were not really explored in depth in the book. The broader political consensus to nation states that needed to be more responsive to the needs of a greater range of their citizens, primarily in terms of economic security and well-being, was brought to bear more directly on the overall argument of European rescue. The European rescue of the nation state argument would not hold without a direct reference to domestic constituents and domestic agendas. And then the theoretical ambitions, I think, quite largely misguided but still symptomatic, that went into the volume of Frontier of National Sovereignty, engaged directly with the notion that integration sprang, I quote, from the evolution of the European nation state, which after World War II has better represented popular will than in the past. So in short, with the essay on allegiance in 1995, Milward was bringing to the surface, I think, and proposing as a core concept what had long been the crucial subtext of his previous work on reconstruction, a sort of undeveloped subtext. That is to say, how had the nation-state changed in post-1945 Western Europe? What were the roots of its newly found democratic reach and solidity? How did it relate to citizens, interest groups, social classes, voters? What were the new and old forms of public allegiance to the nation-state, as well as to Europe and to the larger Atlantic West? These questions had been the premise of his earlier work, the core, as I said, unspoken at first but then progressively more recognized of his search. When reading him backward, we can see, I think, a sensitivity to the profound change in the post-war fabric and texture of European society, in the values, ideas, dynamics that have reshaped the relationship between citizens and state, and the very notion of citizenship. International history had to relate to them fully and squarely. I think this is what he was basically trying to say in the essay on allegiance. And therefore, international history had to broaden into a larger and deeper transnational analysis of economic, social, cultural, political factors that made the modern state. Now, I think it is not difficult to see that the recent sweeping reconsiderations we've had over the last 10 years on the continent's history across the 20th century, think of Mazauer or James Sheehan, they broadly hinge on the nature of the new democratic pact between state and citizens. And they emphasize the cease-change contrast between pre- and post-war Europe in this respect. Indeed, the democratic and welfarist social contract has become the crucial subject matter of our understanding of Europe's post-war history. The interpretive emphasis is, to quote here from another crucial voice in this debate, that of Tony Judd, on the break with the legacy of chauvinism, depression, and authoritarian solutions. The focus is on the endogenous nature of Europe's transformation, even though in relation with worldwide processes, rather than on notions of externally driven change. Milward's work proceeded by in-depth analysis and then daring, occasionally scathing arguments. His approach to history, and especially to historiography, was that of a myth buster, not the accountants, to use a quip from Verrazano, an Italian economic historian involved. Some of his theses were no doubt in the land of extreme, many others robust and persuasive, but they were almost always pathbreaking. They pushed the field forward, they often reshaped its conceptual and interpretive framework of reference. So I think we can conclude conclude that the way we see and think the history of Europe today, the way in which we write the history of Europe today, international, transnational, domestic history, is also, in several ways, direct and indirect of our influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Romero, for this very rich analysis of a complex framework that you have managed to display in an accessible and very challenging way. So thank you very much. Now I would like to open the floor for discussion, so if there is any reaction, comment, question for Professor Romero, please. Yes, Giuliano Garavini, please introduce yourself for...
I'm Giuliano Garavini, now teaching at the St. John's University Rome campus. Actually, I wanted to raise a bit more to think about my question, but since nobody... just the first thing that comes to my mind is that in the end of your presentation of Milward's work, there was kind of difference from what you said in the beginning, in the sense that in the beginning you were sort of arguing that it's now a common knowledge, I would say, that basically the impact of the US empire, in whatever way you want to call it, define what the US empire is, was mainly, well, it was not actually economic, but it was mainly psychological, or it was the changement of the nature of the relationship between in the economy and between workers and industries and so on and so forth. How does this relate to what you were arguing in the end on the fact that the core of Western European reconstruction can be explained sort of internally through the building of a new kind of democracy and of relationship between citizens and politics, which is not anymore chauvinistic, which is different from the one. How do you reconcile in the end these two interpretations? They could go even together if they have the same importance. One is more important than the other. That's a big question.
Yeah, I personally think they can very easily go together, no doubt about that. No, my point was trying to, my point is simply this, that I was asked not only to give this speech to you, but also to write an essay about Milward's work in a sort of fashion-proof book that they are publishing with Routledge, I think, I hope in a few months' time. But anyway, so I basically reread these actually four major works of the period. That is Reconstruction, European Rescue, The Frontiers of National Sovereignty, and that article was the Marshall Plan Necessary that somehow condenses argument in a highly polemical way with American historians. So if you read it now, knowing what sort of legacy this work left behind, and what sort of new venues historians of post-war Europe have explored and taken and combined with old approaches, I was struck by these sort of two levels of analysis. One, which is explicit and well developed, and it's the text of this work of Adam Milward, which is a reasoning of national governance policies, right? More often than not, economic policies, but generally national government policies, and how they were coordinated, adjusted, or they friction with American plans, with each other, and now from this set of frictions and convergences came out the type of arrangements that we know as post-war reconstruction, right? The OEC, the EPU, the Global Steel Community, Milward was an economic historian by education, by mentality, by language, and he remained by and large an economic historian. But I think my point is simply that his inquiries into the reason why post-war reconstruction had been successful, because this, I don't know to what extent this is also true now, but certainly in the 80s this was the major question. Why was post-war reconstruction successful, not only in terms of internal peace, but also in terms of long-term prosperity and growth, vis-a-vis the failure of post-World War I reconstruction? This was the frame of mind that we all operated at the time. In searching the reasons why Western European reconstruction was so successful, the stress came on the way in which national governments appear quite clearly confined in their, if you look at the papers of their negotiations with each other, with the Americans, they were confined within boundaries that were set very rigidly, on the one hand by the geopolitical framework, obviously, but on the other hand by a set of assumptions about what the voters wanted, what the voters would allow or would not allow, by the degree of economic security, again to use a term that was very central to those analyses, that government had to provide to their own citizens. Alan and most of us simply observed this, took it as a major determinant, if not the determinant, of the national policies, especially of France, but also of Italy and Britain, of other countries, and went on to try to explain how these worked out in negotiations with each other, with the Americans. But then if you go and read the European Rescue of the Nation State, this centrality of a new domestic compact between interest groups and the set of interest groups and the state, and the set of citizens' implicit or explicit demands on the state, that the state reflected in their policy choices and their policy options in the international arena, is much more visible, is one crucial part of the argument about the European Rescue of the Nation State. No? Then you read Allegiance, that was written not long after these works, at sort of end of a decade, from Reconstruction to the other books. And there you have the impression that the key component that had been implicit throughout is coming up. The key component, in a way, I think also the key intellectual curiosity that Alan had at the time was, how come that European nation states, in a very similar way between each other, had come to this huge transformation in their crucial element, that is the relationship between state and citizens. This is the real point of change, point of interest for European history. There Alan stops, because he moved to do the official history of British international strategies, in which this element of the domestic compact is present, but it's obviously framed into a completely different story. Okay, we stop the frame there. We move to the major history of European post-war era that we now have. The ones I quoted and several others. Lenin is another one. On top of Punto, Sala, etc. What do we see at the center of this book? What is at the center of this book? It's not the American empire. It's not the global economy. It's the change in the nature of the European nation state in many ways. So there, as I said, in a very indirect way somehow, the work that Milward and the historians did in the 80s has changed some of the elements around which historians build their narrative.
Okay, so Brian, listen to this.
Thanks for a very informative talk. I have a question about, I guess basically Milward's,
Yeah, where's this
sorry.
going?
My name is Brian Shaw from University of Pittsburgh. I'm curious about Milward's Speaking live is not live. My question is about Milward's chapter on the founding fathers, which he uses, I guess, in ironic sense. Basically, I know he was taking on Walter Lippmann's focus on these marginal, small federalist groups. But I wonder if you had some insight into his thinking. His focus on agency, very trying to take it away from Spock and Romain, and perhaps who was he putting it on specifically? This is sort of a question of taking away from them, which I understand challenging him. Who do you think were the people that he was promoting within the governments in terms of setting these policies that redefine the post-war European state?
That's an interesting question. I never thought in those terms, but I think it might be quite revealing. I think that when he was writing European Rescue, and the whole group of people that signed the Frontier National Sovereignty book was sort of discussing, I think, quite closely this issue. At the time, we were very removed from persons, people's faces, and very much into this attempt that retrospectively I think was not particularly useful and did not conduce too much to theorize about European integration, sort of dialogue with social scientists more than historians, and therefore we were much more focused, and he certainly was much more focused on theoretical framework references and therefore structures rather than people. But I think if you could ask Milward to answer your question, I think the honest reply would be high and medium level technocrats, bureaucrats in treasury, commerce departments, on the one hand, the one-way plans, the one-way analysis and produce plans, and therefore set the geometry of limits and possibilities within which agreements could or could not be made. And at together with technocrats and high-level bureaucrats, there would be probably those politicians who were in charge not so much of devising grand ideas and plans, but of actually realizing the political and electoral compromises needed to keep together large coalitions. So, Adenauer, the Gasperi, the political leaders that fashioned the compromise between citizens and state, between voters and political coalitions that sustained and in many ways channeled the policies that led to coercive community, common market, etc. I would venture to say this: mid to high level technocrats plus political leaders rather than visionary leaders.
Somebody else? Okay, in that case, I will have two very short questions for you. One of them is based on a very important notion, I think, in the history of European integration, such as consensus. You talked about the need for interaction, about the need for dialogue, and also about this idea of negotiated interdependence. So, which were the ideas of Milward around this concept of consensus creation internally between the different actors we're talking about? And secondly, when you mentioned this need to study this relationship, this huge transformation in the relation between the state and the citizens, did he ever thought about the role of communication that between the governments and citizens? That is something we very much mention nowadays, even at the level of European institutions. We talk about communication strategies, even about this plan B, dialogue, democracy, and debate between the institutions and the citizens. So, first of all, consensus, then communication strategies.
Well, the answer to the second question is very straight and simple. As far as I can tell, sort of Alan Milward's word was still very much the word in which political parties intellectual horizon. I think the crucial thing, I think you have here to consider also what did he do before. You wrote a book on the economy of war mobilization, comparative. You wrote books about German war effort, economic war effort, Norwegian. I think the key to understand Milward's reading of consensus was the great contrast between depression and post-war. Both in the sense of the new set of economic policies, the Keynesian consensus, and all the ideas that we now sort of know and take somehow for granted, but especially in the sense that I think he had a notion that social demands had changed. Probably this reflected very much his own experience of post-war Britain, but he extended, and this is one interesting thing, that in which Milward was provocative and very interesting, for instance, for people of my generation, that we who came to do history in the 70s were more often than not steeped in a debate on whether Reconstruction has been a victory, a defeat of the left, a victory of conservatives. Milward was basically changing the game. It was saying it was a compromise. It was a compromise that, mind you, worked pretty much in similar ways, whether in conservative Christian democratic Italy or Germany, or in Labour Britain, or in social democratic Scandinavia. The basic components of this social political compromise was largely the same. Building a welfare state, with variations, of course, from one country to the other, but that was a key. Demand management of the economy, distribution of larger economic security. So I think in his mental landscape, this sea change from the Depression era to the post-war era of growth was the centrality of the notion of economic security. The demand, social demands for economic security, the degree of economic security that the governments provided, and this was the bedrock of consensus, which in a way depoliticized the immediate post-war clash and provided this, again, different but in many ways converging or parallel paths to stabilization in countries with different political alignments that in fact much less different than it appeared at the first sight. So I think I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that would work.
Somebody else? Yes, Hitoshi Suzuki.
Yeah, thank you. Hitoshi Suzuki. I'm from Japan and was very briefly out of the Palace at the UI. And this is just one comment. I was struck by the fact that Milward's hypothesis still matters. Of course in Europe, but in terms of EU and EC's relations with Japan, and probably Milward's focus on nation-states do matter, and this becomes more clear when you look into the relations outside Europe, because it is nation-states that you have to deal with Japan. And I was surprised at what you said, that the change in Europe was the nature of the nation-states, relations with citizens and the pressure groups or whatever. Well, that's very true in the Japanese case. So I was surprised that Milward is again back when we have to look at relations outside Europe. Because in the trade conflict, Japan exported too much carbon and active goods to the United States and also to Europe and was criticized. That was the right claim, I think. The most, I would say, the most actor which shifted its position due to its negotiation with the European Commission was the Japanese business lobby, I would say. That they suddenly started saying that, look, our philosophy is probably still that of a developing country. And this did not occur before when it was arguing with the United States. But this suddenly started when they had to negotiate with the Commission. And it was said that this is not only about statistics. You're causing a political problem in Europe, so you have to look at it from social statistics. Probably this argument that the nation states do still matter. I mean, the Commission has to be committed, but still, it is the nation state, and its relations with the society, the public, whatever you want to call it, does make it. So I was struck to hear your story and the argument in the floor that Milward is not like a man from the past, but whatever he seemed to study, and he seemed to say, still matters. So the only thing is that if he explored more about the external relations outside DC, like, well, of course he touched British Commonwealth, etc., but if he did touch more about the external relations, and if you do know something, if he was more interested in something like that, I would like your point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you largely. No. I mean, I think that if asked about it, he would easily sort of integrate Japan in this, post-war Japan in this view, because the analogies and the similarities are very deep, of course. But frankly, no, Japan was sort of beyond the mental horizon of Alan at the time, or almost everybody else who worked in Western Europe at the time. Let's be frank about it. We just did not.
Also, I think for me, where external relations were the relations between France, with Britain. For us, the external relations, in a way, they could also be the relations
Certainly.
between Europe and Japan.
Yeah, certainly the focus of inquiry was almost entirely on Western European nations and the United States. To a certain extent, the colonial and post-colonial branching out, especially in the case of the book about Britain, of course, but Japan was sort of, we knew it was there, but somewhere else, frankly. I think there is another point that I think we have to retrospectively to think about it and again to historicize it. I mean, even though I signed up to that book, The Frontier of National Sovereignty, with all its claim on theorizing, I think that was a mistake, frankly, to put the word theory so deeply in that book. In which sense that we were trying, Alan, Vibeke Sorensen, Roger Renier, Frank H, myself, to say, listen, we historians now have something to say that matters also to political scientists and social scientists that were dominating, of course, the theoretical debate about European integration. So listen to us, listen to the work we've done with sources, because we can tell you something that your theories basically do not understand and do not encompass. And as such, I think the point was good, and is still good now, that the origins, but I stress the origins of European integration are to be found within the set of international governments arrangements. Okay? But by saying that this was a theory and stressing the word theory, we, I think, created the delusion, not so much among ourselves, because after all, we are historians, but in the wider debate, that Alan's was an attempt to define an overall theory of integration, which for historians, it doesn't make sense to begin with. Okay? You never make theories about very large. So if we historicize now all these set of arguments, it seems clear. I would, for instance, myself, be quite prepared to defend the notions that the origins of European integrations were primarily and largely in a set of international governments, arrangements and accords, but I would not extend this notion as a long-term theory of European integration. I think the dynamics of European integration has become simply more complex in the 60s, 70s and 80s or nowadays, in which you have national governments and you have European institutions and you have other dynamics and other actors. So if we read Milward historically as an historian of the origins of European integration, then you can even venture to use the word theory, but it doesn't really serve such a function. But if we get rid of this, I think, misunderstanding, large extent of our own making, I have to admit. Then I think, and we, as I said, historicize Milward's work and that generation of historians' work, and then you have an argument that I think still stands quite strongly. And I mean, it's not by chance that if you read, Johnson and the reconstruction of Coastal Europe, they rely not on Milward's directly, not on that sort of thinking very much. And certainly that applies to that in a way. Really.
Some other question, reaction from the panel? Okay, if there are no more questions, I thank you once again for this very clarifying contribution that I think will encourage people to rediscover Alan Milward, and I thank the participants for their dynamism. Thank you very much.
I think we can start. I think we can start with the first panel now. So it's panel 1, perspective on enlargements, meaning, shortcomings, and achievements. So Kristoffersen, Leikam, and Silva, Rodrigues, and Giuliano, Garavini, and Discussant.
So we're starting our first panel, and since we're late, we might end up having our discussion after the break. I'll just give you the floor very quickly. The first paper is by Kristoffersen from the University of Oslo. It's organized opposition to the EC membership in Norway, 1970-1972.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to come here and talk about my favorite topic, Norway and European integration. The referendum on Norwegian membership in European Union was a very close race. When no was secured by 53.5% vote on 25 September 1972, it marked the end of 2 years intense debate which had caused the downfall of one cabinet, and the second was soon to resign. The debate had also seen the rise of a large grassroots movement at an unprecedented level in Norwegian post-war political history. So here we see a picture from the election night with the arrow turning around the 50% no, nay, and yes. So in the end it was small margin in favor of the no. While opposition The proliferation of organized Eurosceptic mass movements is a relatively new phenomenon. 1954, during the EDC debate in France, there were public campaigns directed against the project, but it never developed into a mass movement as such. And the British application for membership in 1961 entailed formation of the Anti-Common Market League in the United Kingdom. And in Norway and also Denmark, the first steps towards mobilization of popular masses were taken by Eurosceptic elite groups from agraria, leftist and trade union circles. Now, these early developments were elite-driven, and because the French dropped enlargement on them in 1959, the question remained for most of the time a discussion at the level of political parties, public institutions, and organized interest groups. However, this changed when the EC enlargement process was resumed from 1970 onwards with the reopening of negotiations. It was clear to the Eurosceptic actors and group in Norway that the successful mobilization of these counter forces was crucial in order to prevent Norway becoming a member of the EC. So there was early mobilization, and that was important, an important aspect which came to dominate the whole debate, domestic debates from 1970 onwards. Now, recent events in EU history also adds relevance to the study of early opposition to European integration, although studying these processes, I think, carry importance in itself as an important part of the evolution of the EU. And we see that the referendums in France, Netherlands, and Ireland during the last years may lead us to see Norwegian resistance to Euro during the early 1970s in a different perspective. Because where Norway in particular has been portrayed as a reluctant European, the process of growing popular resistance to Euro displayed at least since Maastricht in the early 1990s opens up the possibility for a new understanding of the anti-EC-EU movements in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, seeing them more as front runners in a process where the public is increasingly getting involved in foreign policy decisions, and thus seeing them not as much as reluctant foot draggers as has been the case before. Now, there is certainly not a direct causal link here, and Euroscepticism was not invented by the Norwegians, but this phenomenon of popular resistance to integration seems to be an expression of certain tendencies that existed also in other countries, but only have found their expression during the last 2 decades. Now, in the Norwegian context, it doesn't really make sense to distinguish between hard and soft Eurosceptics. Soft Eurosceptics being people who are against certain elements of the integration process, but doesn't challenge it as such. In the Norwegian context of 1772, all the Eurosceptics are hard Eurosceptics that are challenging the very existence of the EC project. Now, there were a large number of these ad hoc groups coming together, but the most important one, which we will particular focus on here, is the people's movement against Norwegian membership in EC, and also it is interesting to look at the Labour Information Committee, which was an important partner for the people movements, and we'll get into that role. The one important reason for the no in 1972 is found in the success of these forces to mobilize early and on a large scale. So by setting up the People's Movement already in 1970, these forces were able to gain considerable advance in terms of securing electoral support when the referendum took place 2 years after. So the proponents of the yes membership, especially at cabinet level, had cornered themselves into a position where they would not take any official position until negotiations were completed. And the negotiations were completed only in early 1972, which meant that this People's Movement had been out there arguing with force against membership of cabinet ministers, had their hands tied by this wait-and-see strategy. So this people's movement was founded as a coalition of leftists, left-wingers, trade unionists, and agrarians. So we see on the left there is a trade union represented there, iron and steel worker. In the middle there is the chief of Norwegian Farmers Association, Hans Borgel, who was also a prominent member of the Center Party, the Agrarian Party. A very unusual combination of forces. You wouldn't expect these two to really have something in common, except for this issue. They are both very much against Norwegian membership. So on the political side, if you look at political parties, the only political party united in favor of membership was the Conservative Party. And as a member of the center-right government coalition in 1970, the Conservatives faced strong Euroscepticism from the coalition partner, Agrarian Center Party, while two other coalition parties were divided. So Labour returned to power in 1971, contained a safe majority for membership, but opposition to membership was strongly advocated by a powerful minority on the left wing. This was an awkward situation for the Labour Party because the key leaders were fervently in favour of joining the EC. So how should they proceed to secure broad support from Labour voters while at the same time avoiding splitting up the party? So the leadership was confronted with the same situation as where earlier internal party confrontations on Labour policy had caused a faction on the left to break out in 1961. And this in turn had led to Labour Party losing parliamentary majority. So maintaining the party unity was a crucial question for the Labour leadership during the enlargement process. That meant that they had to allow this Labour movement information committee to form. And during 1971 there was growing discontent from Labour, left-wingers and the youth movement and certain trade unions with the way the EC question was handled by party leaders. So they said that this committee in January 1972 was not formally accepted by the leadership, but it wasn't really opposed either. So we see below here two of the people involved in that. One of the glasses is Björn, who later was Norwegian foreign minister during the membership negotiations in the early 90s. So he changed his mind from that period. Well, this committee was not a popular organization in the same way as the People's Movement. It was organized with a board based in Oslo, and they had a large network of contacts in the local party organization. So it wasn't designed to be a big mass organization, but was designed to create a sense among Labour voters that it was perfectly possible to vote Labour and still be against membership in the EC. So the aim was to have a popular outreach and to provide an alternative position for Labour voters. So if we go into the arguments of this, it's clear that there's a surprising element was that the people movement is largely leftist leaning, despite the dominant position of the agrarian actors and Central Party, which is not at all socialist or left-wing party at that time. It has changed later, but that's, we won't get into that. It is generally also asserted that Norwegians voted no to the membership treaty because they believe the interests of fishermen and farmers were at risk within the EC system. This is of course true to a large degree, but in order to provide better understanding of Euroscepticism, or where we should take into account other arguments as well. Now, if you go into the primary sector arguments first, it's certain that the cap on agricultural policy would entail 50% reduction of the number of farmers in Norway, because direct state subsidies will no longer be allowed, and it will not be possible to make a living from farming. And concerning fishing, the rights of fishing will no longer be controlled by Norwegian authorities. It was claimed, and the fisheries policy would make foreign trawlers gaining access to Norwegian waters to the detriment of local coast-based small fishing boats, and again, this would lead to additional fishing resources. So there was a shared belief, and this was actually shared both on the yes and the no side, that the cap and the CFP were dangerous to the Norwegian primary sector. So the difference actually lay in the yes side's belief that they could negotiate a viable solution, while the no side did not believe that that was possible, and they fervently opposed the solution that came on the table in 1972. So the overall consequence, as seen by the Eurosceptics, was that it would no longer be possible to maintain a pattern of settlement in rural and coastal areas. And as I said, this was shared by both sides, but the key element here was, did they really trust the EC to go into other arrangements? Now, of course, these were significant arguments on the no side, but in the broader perspective, the other issues were also important. And if we look at the quote from Hans Borgen, he says that, well, we must win this struggle not only for the sake of the market issue, but for the sake of democracy. Our population and the future of democracy in this country need to prove that it is worthwhile to oppose overwhelming power, to oppose the government, capitalist power, big industry, and mass media. And this is, of course, very strong words for well, it kind of sounds a bit left-wing socialist, and coming from a farmer's leader who is not all into that kind of speech is really an interesting feature of how this developed. So he does not speak about the primary sector. He speaks about all the other bigger issues, and by doing so, and this is part of the very important part of the People's Movement rhetoric, and by focusing on this, they succeeded in promoting, which you can say is a certain idea of Europe, which may or may not have been accurate, but the interesting feature here is that it tells us a lot about how Europe and its were viewed by this organization. So other key elements in that outlook were that they wanted to emphasize on the decoupling of Europe and EC. EC is not an expression of the European idea, but rather, as they said, a perversion of it. Another thing is that EC is viewed by its nature as a construction made to promote capitalist interest to the detriment of other concerns such as gender equality, social equality, regional policy, and environmental issues. Thirdly, European integration represented a threat to democracy by taking key decisions away from national parliaments and away from citizens, leading them to an unclear structure with complicated procedures. And further, the EC's political ambitions pointed towards the formation of a third superpower with disastrous implications for world peace and development. Viewed as already viewed as a neo-colonialist bloc that represented a large obstacle for the development of third world countries.
And finally, and the most important argument was that the loss of sovereignty would influence every policy area, either directly, as in the case of the primary sector, trade policy and capital movements, but also indirectly in the case of social policy and gender equality. Now, I think it's fair to say that important forces within this people's movement were not only arguing against membership in the EEC as such, they were also promoting or arguing in favor of transformation of national and international politics. And they represented a rejection of great power politics and the influence of international capitalism. The policy of economic growth had to be replaced by a value-based outlook focusing on social equality and environmental factors. Now, the arguments of the Labour Information Committee are not substantially different from that of the People's Movement, but the Labour part of this were explicitly referring more to socialist values than what the People's Movement would allow itself to do. So although there were two separate organizations, there is no doubt that the Labour Information Committee acted in close coordination with the People's Movement, and to some extent the people involved in developing the arguments were in both organizations. As mentioned earlier, the purpose of the Information Committee was to provide legitimacy to the no voters in Labour, give a strong profile of yes advocates within the party leadership. It was crucial for Labour Eurosceptics to provide some kind of united stand against this front, while at the same time not provoking the party majority, which had voted in favour of membership at the party congress. The Information Committee played a crucial role in the last phase of the membership campaign, and it's no coincidence that it was formed at the same time as the accession treaty was completed and the cabinet's real campaign in favour of membership started. Certainly, a counterfactual question, but could be an important one. Without the Labour Information Committee, would the yes have prevailed, or at least increased its chances? Margins were small, and it's likely that many Labour voters in doubt would have supported the party leadership. The picture is complicated because the Prime Minister also said that he would resign if the yes lost the referendum, thus putting pressure on his own voters who were in doubt, a couple of them. And it was interpreted at least as an attempt to pressurize undecided voters. So no voters will be held responsible for Labour losing power. However, the undercurrents in the party were so strong that one might have had the same result anyway, with or without this Information Committee. The youth movement was very active, and the People's Movement had important allies at the Labour left wing and within the trade union. Well, let's just close up by looking at this picture from the painter, very ardent Euro-skeptic activist Rolf Jochen, who made this painting in 1972 as part of the, I should say, the People's Movement propaganda. It summarizes, in an interesting way, some main arguments of Eurosceptics by displaying the conservative leader, Koivilok at the left, sitting on Labour Prime Minister Kristoffersen's lap, thus illustrating the unholy alliance between the Labour Party and the Conservatives in the bid to get Norway into the EEC. They are, as we see, the flag is down, they are sitting on it, representing the betrayal committed against Norwegian national sovereignty, and you see the abandoned farmhouses in the back, and then further in the back some dark eagle-shaped industrial structure moving in the background. Now the German reference is quite apparent, but it remains unclear whether this is just an allusion to German industry or is summarized very succinctly, so I'll let them follow my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks very much also for this conversation. So now I will give the floor to Leikam, from Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, and not only he's a researcher, but he also, I think, helps in the research for historical exhibitions. So he has multiple abilities, and he's going to present on a fine system, the CAP, Commonwealth Sugar and Britain's entry into the European Community, 1970-1975.
Thank you very much for the introduction. In the center of my paper are the British applications for EEC membership and the negotiations on sugar imports from the developing Commonwealth countries. More precisely, this paper analyzes the problems the EEC sugar policy created for both the United Kingdom and the sugar-producing Commonwealth during Britain's applications. Doing so, this paper allows a look at the community sugar policy from outside, from a country which tried to become a member of the EEC, and from developing countries which depend heavily on sugar exports to Europe. My paper is divided into 4 parts. The first part explains the sugar policies of the Commonwealth and of the community. The second part examines the British entry bid of 1967 and the discussions about Commonwealth sugar. The third part focuses on the negotiations about Britain's entry into the EEC and the solutions agreed on for sugar imports from the Commonwealth. The last part deals with the negotiations on the Lorraine Convention, which was finally to settle the sugar imports from the Commonwealth. In Britain, the production and the import of sugar were regulated by the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, CSA, which restricted the domestic production in favor of imports from the Commonwealth. Under the CSA, London bought a certain quantity of sugar from Commonwealth countries at a fixed price. The main producers were developing countries like Jamaica or Mauritius, most of them highly dependent on the sugar exports to the UK. In the EEC, sugar was part of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which aimed at increasing the production within the community and restricting imports from outside. The significant feature of the CAP was the introduction of common prices for agricultural products. Usually, these prices were set well above world market levels. So, the sugar policies of Britain and of the EEC differed fundamentally. Whereas the CSA intended to meet the demand with imports from the Commonwealth, the CAP aimed at meeting the demand with the domestic production. Consequently, London's approach to the EEC was a major threat to the sugar exporting Commonwealth countries. If Britain became a member of the EEC, it would have to join the community policies, including the CAP. As a consequence, the current export levels and the export revenues of the sugar exporting Commonwealth members were at risk. London had to work out a solution which would show the UK as a good member of the community and at the same time would not endanger the exporting interests of and Britain's relations with the developing Commonwealth countries. In 1963, Britain's first attempt to become a member of the community failed. But already in 1966, London discussed whether to apply again for EEC membership. In that context, officials pointed out that it would not be easy to secure sugar imports from the Commonwealth at present levels, since the community was already a net exporter of sugar. The ongoing deliberation within London had serious repercussions in the sugar exporting Commonwealth countries. Especially the Caribbean countries were concerned about Britain's possible entry into the EC. The government of Jamaica declared that its trade relations with the UK were most important. As the future of the CSA was still under consideration, London was reluctant to give any detailed guarantees. Consequently, the government of Kingston proposed a bilateral trade agreement between Jamaica and Britain. But London was not willing to enter such an agreement, since the EC members might regard it as proof that we were still not fully aware of the real implications of the common market arrangements. In April 1967, the Cabinet decided to apply for EC membership, and officials started defining the negotiating aims. Concerning the sugar imports from the Canada, they suggested that the CSA should not be extended beyond 1974, the year it was scheduled to terminate. Nevertheless, they regarded it as essential to safeguard the interests of the developing sugar-producing Commonwealth countries. But there was disagreement about what to demand from the EC. The Commonwealth Office suggested that after 1974, the countries concerned should be allowed to continue to export to Britain at current levels. However, other departments argued that the domestic production would have to be severely restricted if the current levels were to be maintained. They suggested that export earnings of the Commonwealth countries should not be reduced. This formula left undecided whether these earnings would result from the present supply level or from reduced quantities purchased at higher prices. In November 1967, the British government officially decided not to extend the CSA beyond 1974. But this step did not help its policy towards the EC. Only shortly afterwards, de Gaulle used his veto to block London's entry. But this was only a temporary relief for the sugar exporting Commonwealth members, since London decided to uphold its application. After de Gaulle left office, the relations between Britain and the EC intensified. In early 1970, the beginning of entry negotiations was near, and London started defining its aims, including those for the sugar imports from the Commonwealth. Officials took up the considerations of 1967. They concluded that Britain should fulfill the CSA until 1974. Concerning the time after 1974, they point out that imports from the Commonwealth at present levels would only allow for a limited increase in the UK production. So they recommended to reduce the imports, but to pay the EC sugar price instead of the CSA price in order to maintain the current level of export earnings. In June 1970, ministers discussed this proposal. Whereas the majority agreed to reduce the imports, some ministers voiced serious concerns. They argued that the reduction of the sugar production might cause major economic and social problems in the countries concerned, even if the current level of export earnings was maintained. So, the British government was unable to agree on a negotiation position by the time the talks with the EC members started. Moreover, as the solution we sought was still disputed, London was reluctant to discuss its negotiating aims with the sugar exporting Commonwealth members. In May 1971, the EC members tabled a proposal for the sugar imports from the Commonwealth. It recommended that the regulations for the time after 1974 should not be worked out during Britain's entry negotiations, but later, during the negotiations for the new association agreement, which was to be concluded in early 1975. At the same time, the EC promised that the interests Shortly afterwards, London started to prepare for the negotiations about the new association agreement, the Romero Convention. Ministers agreed that Britain should aim at sugar imports from the developing Commonwealth countries at current levels, namely 1.4 million tons per year. Already in summer 1973, there was some optimism that a solution acceptable to the Commonwealth members might be achieved. For the future sugar policy, the European Commission proposed importing 1.4 million tons per year from the developing countries taking part in the Romero Convention. But in spring 1974, a new situation developed. The sugar exporting Commonwealth members did not fulfill the current export quotas to the UK. This was due to a massive increase of the world market price for sugar, which rose not only above the CSA, but also above the community price. So, for the Commonwealth countries, it was more attractive to export to the US at world market prices instead of exporting to Britain. London was very unhappy about the situation and discussed about how to react to these developments. Should it continue to support the Commonwealth countries and press for imports at current levels? Officials warned that changing the British negotiating aims would be regarded and represented by the Commonwealth as going back on our commitment on them. Thus, London decided, despite the current problems, to continue to strive for imports at current levels from the developing Commonwealth countries. In November 1974, a major breakthrough was achieved. The EC agreed to allow the developing countries to export 1.4 million tons at a negotiated price into the community. The main reason for this breakthrough can be seen in the fact that due to the higher demand in the sea, it seemed possible to increase the domestic production and to import the quantities demanded. Besides, the EEC stated that if one country fell short of the quotas assigned, its rate for the following year would be reduced. This rule should make sure that the agreed quantities would in fact be delivered. However, the exact price still had to be set. The sugar exporting Commonwealth countries demanded that the price should be set in relation to the world market price, which in late 1974 was falling, but still well above community price. The EC members rejected this idea and stated that the price paid for the sugar imported should be within the range of the community price. Eventually, in late 1975, just before signing the Romero Agreement, the developing countries agreed with the EC's proposal. It can be assumed that the falling world market price of sugar made
that we don't have to hear with attention the last presentation. So we're moving here from the chaotic decade of the 70s to the even more chaotic time of today. And the presentation by Sonia Rodrigues from the Portuguese Institute of International Relations will be on the very important question, further enlargement after the crisis. She's going to answer.
Well, thank you. And now, for something completely different, I'm going to talk about the possibilities of further enlargement after the crisis. By further enlargement, I would mean the prospect for accession in Western Balkans, Turkey, and Iceland. And after the crisis, I mean also after the 2007 crisis impact and on the present 2010 sovereign debt crisis that is affecting presently Greece and Irish more specifically. So the European external relations have been marked by processes of widening European integration, and the most effective instrument for doing this is through the enlargements and the neighborhood policies. So through the establishment of democratic regimes and liberal economies, the immediate neighborhood of the European Union, Western Balkans, Turkey, and even South Caucasus, have been suffering some structural reforms, some in order to get in the European Union, the others only just as a stability promoter instrument. So if both instruments, the enlargement and the neighborhood policies, have similar objectives like giving these regions political stability through democratic reforms, the Iceland's case is completely different. The Iceland is a present reflex of the present financial and economical crisis, and being able to meet all the Copenhagen criteria, the main reason for them to apply to the European Union is connected with economic and financial needs and guarantees that the European Union can give them once again after being bankrupted after the 2007 American Oslo effect. So this paper will argue that although in the present economic and financial crisis, the European Union still has the ability to promote and to attract states that do not have the need for political legitimization, but rather to have some kind of economical and fiscal stability. In the other two cases, the Western Balkans and the Turkish case, the need for political legitimization and having the European umbrella for a democratic regime or consolidated democratic regime is still a need for that. So underlying problems also in Macedonia with the name issue, dispute with Greece, and Montenegro needing to do some real further democratic reforms, the big test will rely on Croatia 2013 accession tests. So these are more these countries do not have such a huge problems in deepening the European accession process, but the main problems, the main issues rely on Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, and also Albania, that also need very deeply democratic reforms. So very much has changed after 2003 European strategy for the Western Balkans, mainly the issue of Kosovo and Serbia, and I will not speak that much about this, but if you want later I can develop a little bit more the European approach to this very huge problem that could and can still lead for an important focus on instability in the region. So, in the case of the Western Balkans, the European integration perspective is seen as a normative instrument for having peace and stability in the region, and that can be confirmed by the European fragile balance between Serbian integration deepening and the question for Kosovo independence. So, European Union institutions have been having a very balanced and fragile posture in this issue, as they have to have, of course, but it's very interesting to look to the real measures in the ground. So after the referendum in Slovenia that allowed international mediation in the dispute with Zagreb, as I said before, the future test for European enlargement will have to take place with Croatia in 2 years. In Macedonia, the historical conflict between Skopje and Athens over the name dispute will still go on, and there is no, I think, prospect for resolving that, as we saw in the NATO summit in 2008. So for Bosnia, the main task will remain to keep the state as one single country, and Montenegro and Albania will have to do real reforms in order to improve their accession process. Passing to Turkey, the eternal candidate for European Union, I put here some key points about the problems and the issues and the controversies about the Turkey accession to the European Union. I put the pros and the cons, so trying to keep it in both ways. So first we have the geography issues. So Turkish capital is not in Europe, and most of its territory is in Asia. Although the geostrategic position of Turkey is very crucial, and that's why it has the US support for going in the European Union. According to population, the population weight of Turkish population, if Turkey was a member state, will have, I think in 2014, the same weight of German population. So in terms of policy making, that would be also an issue, but on the other hand, it could be contribute very much for a future military power. Concerning immigration, European Union population is aging, so it needs more and more people, but on the other hand, the German, French and Dutch experience of problems related to Turkish immigration since the 60s is still a very crucial equilibrium in this issue. Also, the Arab culture and Islam Icelandic people is able to meet, the Icelandic regime is able to meet all the criteria of Copenhagen, so there are only small issues with the Netherlands and the fishery codes. And these they are intended to go in the European Union. Ironically confirms that the European Union is still an attractive power, even during its worst financial and economic crisis ever, and that they need for financial and economic stability guarantees, which European Union accession would give them. So, even this would mean that some loss of fiscal sovereignty and things like that. Iceland have all the characteristics to go in the European, but it will depend on them if they want to join or not. So, but easily they could be inside the European Union much faster than the previous candidates. So finally, I would say that the EU's external relations with countries in their periphery still have some common template, like promoting democratic reforms and having stability and peace in the periphery, in the regions of Western Balkans, Turkey case. But although some policies are being made through the enlargement process and through the neighborhoods policy instruments in other regions, we can see further reforms in the countries in which the perspective of real accession to the European Union is more effective. So in the Western Balkans, in some cases, we can see huge reforms, and very quickly they could go in if we didn't have a financial crisis. So if the Western Balkans and Turkey confirms the political stability, European Union ability to promote these reforms, and Iceland case the financial stability. On the other hand, the present crisis will certainly, I'm not sure, slow the process of enlargement. We will see this with the Croatian case in 2 years, but some authors and some political decisors are currently giving other options for the enlargement, while it's taking more slowly. We could saw last year, I'm not sure yet, last year, the visa-free travel for the Western Balkans. So for the European integration, while the enlargement is taking place more slowly, and recently some politicians have also suggested a privileged partnership instead of full membership. This was the case for Turkey, of course. The Turkish rejected. So at the end, these cases of neighborhood policies and enlargement instruments confirms that the Union role as a normative project of regional stabilization and also a source of financial and